In Chapter 17, we're going to talk about light. And so we've got the studio a little bit dim so that we can do some light experiments. Now in Chapter 15 and 16, we talked about waves. And particularly we talked about sound waves, but we mentioned that light is a wave as well. Now light is a wave of electric and magnetic fields, and that's something we'll consider in some detail in Chapter 25. But for now, we're just going to talk about wave optics. We'll talk about what we can say about light, given the fact that it's a wave. And we're going to relate it to things we said about previously with waves. Now, light's a wave. The wavelength is very, very small. So under normal circumstances, you don't notice the wave nature. If I have a light bulb here, and I cast a shadow of a pencil, the shadow has pretty sharp edges. The shadow has pretty sharp edges. But if I take light and I pass it through a tiny aperture, the wave nature comes into play, and I get something called diffraction. So now what I'm going to do is take a laser and I'm going to shine it through a single slit. And then what happens is the light spreads out. And when the light hits the screen, you can see this was going through a single slit, and I get this broad central spot. And the light has spread out. The slit runs this way. The light spreads out like so. And actually, I get dark bands as well. So the light spreads out. We call that diffraction. But also, I get these dark spots. And the dark bands result from destructive interference of crests and troughs, which happens with light as well as with sound. But now, we're going to consider light from two sources. We're going to consider light that passes through a double slit. Okay? So I'm going to put in two slits, and the light from two slits hits the screen. And we get this pattern on the screen. Now I want you to notice something. First off, there's a broad central spot, and then there's dark spots here. This pattern that you see here is basically two single slit patterns which are overlapped on top of each other. And you can see that, because if I take the light from one slit and I block it, watch what happens. And right there I get a pattern from a single slit. But now I bring in light from the second slit, and then I get two patterns that overlap. And where do they overlap? Where I have crests, meaning crests, and troughs, meaning troughs, I get a bright spot. Where I have crests, meaning troughs, I get a dark spot. And so I get regions of constructive interference and regions of destructive interference. I get light and dark bands. And this is a so-called double slit interference pattern. And we explore this in some detail in Chapter 17. And we have a basic relationship that describes the appearance of the pattern that you see. D represents the spacing between the two slits that produce the pattern. Now we have a question for you. If we increase the spacing between the two slits, what is going to happen to the spacing between the dark fringes that we see right here? So the two slits are getting farther apart, distance D is getting bigger. What is going to happen to the spacing between those dark fringes that you see? We'll give you some choices. Okay, this is the pattern that results from two slits of a fixed spacing. I'm going to turn the wheel, so I'm going to have a pattern from two slits, but I have variable spacing. But now, I'm going to take the slits and make them farther apart. And when that happens, you can see the fringes get closer and closer together. And right here, you can still see the dark fringes, but they're very, very tightly spaced indeed. And as the spacing gets wider and wider and wider, the fringes get closer and closer together until at some point it becomes almost indistinguishable from the original pattern that we had. The dark fringes are so close together. And that's typically what happens with diffraction. If the aperture is big enough or aperture is far enough apart, you end up having something which is pretty much indistinguishable from what you've seen before. There is diffraction, there is interference, but the scale is small enough that you don't see it. Now, in fact, anytime light goes through an aperture, you have these diffraction effects. And we'll see in the chapter that limits the resolution of optical devices. But now, we'll do one more thing. You've seen that you can have constructive and destructive interference with light from two different slits. But you can also get constructive and destructive interference if you have multiple reflections. That's a piece we'll look at in the next segment.